Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of News from a World in Flux. My name's Clare Farrell.
I'm Charlie Gardner.
And today we're going to talk about one of the most controversial subjects in the climate movement space, solar radiation management. The reason why we're going to talk a little bit about that and the broader topic of geoengineering is because I've just come back recently from a conference in Finland. I was invited by a group called Operatio Arctis to come to their Atlas 25 conference, which is really about tipping points, but very much focused on situating ourselves, I guess, in the position that we actually are with the data that we actually have, which is that we've breached 1.5 degrees. And according to James Hansen, probably one of the most revered climate scientists in the world ever, he also says 2 degrees is basically locked in, and there's no doubt in his mind about that. So you won't hear that from the IPCC, but you will hear it from one of the most respected voices in the world, so it's something to be taken very seriously. And before we get on to that, Charlie, there's also other reports, right, about the state of our planetary system. So do you want to just go ahead and mention some of the other reports that are telling us how serious things are before we move into that?
Yeah, so the background to the discussions you were having in Helsinki is that, unsurprisingly, the state of the planetary system is getting really seriously fucked. The data's just been released for the 2024 data for atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. And the headline finding was that it was a record leap. So obviously we know atmospheric concentrations are getting higher and higher every year because we haven't stopped burning fossil fuels. But the year-to-year jump in concentrations was the largest it's ever been since they started having reliable data in the 50s. So this was really shocking news. It jumped 3.5 parts per million to 424 parts per million. And yeah, pretty fucked. And obviously the main component of this is because we haven't stopped burning fossil fuels. We're just emitting more and more into the atmosphere all the time. And that would be worrying enough, you know, the fact that this trend is continuing, but that doesn't explain all the increase in atmospheric concentrations. And the other reasons might be even more worrying. So one is just the huge amounts of wildfires we've been having around the world. Like obviously it's a year-round story now. There's always some part of the world burning. And that's a real problem because obviously forests are a massive carbon sink. So when forests burn, they release all these greenhouse gases. It's an additional problem for further down the line because when forests burn, if they don't recover, that means the carbon sink is smaller. So there's less of a sponge to recover in the future. But it might not just be forest fires. It might be that other carbon sinks around the world are losing their capacity to absorb as much of our emissions as they used to. So, I mean, you'll remember we've talked about this several times, but very roughly, of all the emissions that we emit into the atmosphere, roughly a quarter are absorbed by the ocean, a quarter are absorbed by forests and soils and the living world on land, and half of them stay in the atmosphere where they cause climate change. As the planet's heating, it's not just forests that aren't able to store as much because they're burning. The oceans, for example, warmer waters can absorb less carbon dioxide. So there are signs basically that the natural buffers, these natural sinks, aren't doing the amazing job for us that they used to. So this record leap in atmospheric concentrations tells 2 worrying stories. It's, you know, we haven't sorted the emissions, and the planet is less able to absorb those emissions. The second very worrying recent sort of scientific finding was the latest report from the Tipping Points folk, which again has just been released just prior to COP30, so in October. And they reached the headline conclusion that we have reached our first tipping point in the planetary system. And that's warm water corals. You know, we've exceeded the temperature thresholds at which they can survive. We've seen mass coral bleaching around the world, increasingly over recent years, but the tipping points folk have reached this conclusion that we have now passed this tipping points for corals. It doesn't mean all warm water corals are going extinct. There might be pockets that survive here or there in little sheltered places, but it means that, yeah, this planet can no longer support mass coral reef ecosystems. And this is huge news for a number of reasons. You know, coral reefs support about a quarter of all the life in the oceans. They support fisheries that provide the primary source of dietary protein for 1 billion people. So, you know, and obviously they've been dying for a while, and these impacts have been unfolding. But the idea, but beyond the like actual concrete impacts, there's this conceptual impact that we have now passed this tipping point. So it's, you know, you can really clearly say in like scientific or biological terms, the world is just not the same place as it was very recently. So it's it's quite tough news in terms of the planetary system. It's clear that all the stuff we've been talking about all these years hasn't been enough, you know, and the situation is getting worse and getting worse rapidly, which is why people are now having to start having, you know, really, really difficult conversations about where that leaves us and what we can do next. So tell us about these conversations you were having in Helsinki.
It all relates, doesn't it? Because one of the things that came up for me before going to the Helsinki conference, which was called Atlas 2025, which is the weight of the world on you, kind of is obviously the frame. But one of the things that I came with as a question was, you know, if warmer water can absorb less CO2 and sustain less plankton, let's say, which also helps to absorb CO2, which is also helping to seed the clouds. Hansen's work being about clouds partly. You know, we see this sort of complicated interrelationship between the living systems of the Earth and the climate sort of system, if you like. How those things are knitted together. What you've just said as well, that we're in a position where some people are starting to say, okay, the shit is hitting the fan and now we've got to have some really tough decisions, tough conversations. Deciding not to act is the same as deciding to take an action, because inaction is an action, is a decision. You know, the more that we find ourselves sort of cornered, I think, in terms of not knowing how to reduce human-made emissions, because we just don't know how to tame our human-made systems, and we're watching the sort of living natural systems of the planet spiralling away in ways that have been predicted, that we knew broadly would happen, perhaps not accurately, but enough to know this was on the cards. It's just it's all coming sooner. It feels like, you know, that's one of the things that I tried to prepare myself for was to engage in conversations with people about forest cover, deforestation, ocean protection. You know, how are we looking at stopping the destruction of things that we know help a bit, you know, and the ways that we're perhaps campaigning on you know, what Jem Bendel's described as like a sort of carbon totalitarian kind of view, rather than like a holistic view, which is like, yes, carbon, and also all these other things which play into the carbon cycle and the water cycle and all of the other things that are going on. But anyway, at this conference, there was several keynotes talking about, one of them in particular, Ramstorff, talking about the AMOC breakdown and, slowdown, and the slowdown of like subsystems within that sort of bigger system, which for some people who were there, I think was possibly like the most hard-hitting presenting that took place. I think because I've never sat in a room full of people, including activists, government ministers, scientists, economists, I mean, there was all sorts of people there. Having that discussion in that way about not just the fact that there is an AMOC risk that affects Europe in a way that I think a lot of the sort of earlier conversations about climate change didn't. I think people in Europe felt that it didn't really include them, right? Because it was all like, oh, this is going to be bad for people where it's hot, where global south, where people who didn't cause it, there's an injustice. We all know that story and we all know that effort that's been made on that campaigning front, but I don't think there's that many people in Europe who have really confronted the prospect of feeling the force of something that pushes temperatures in the other direction and makes it impossible eventually to grow crops and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it was a really like challenging series of presentations, panels, conversations that took place. I have to say the morning session that I joined with Jim was the most coherent and easy to follow kind of presentation that I've seen of his recent work. So although it's a massive punch in the guts, because the information is horror, basically, the presentation itself was very well put together by him, I thought.
It's worth people watching if we put it in the notes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, his work has been about climate sensitivity and the system being more sensitive than we thought. And I know we talked about that in previous episode, and also about how much aerosols have been affecting the climate because of their impact on cloud seeding. One of the things I tried to establish in that conversation with him was that by changing the shipping fuel regulations, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, have removed all this sulfur from international shipping fuels, which has had a massive effect on the air quality over the shipping lanes, which has changed the nature of cloud formation in those places. Jim was very clear that, you know, all those news articles earlier this year saying like scientists are bewildered about why it's so hot, so fast and so sudden. His presentation was quite a simple distillation of his work, I felt, compared to, I mean, his work's complicated, to the point where he would say, you know, people have said that they're surprised, they shouldn't be surprised. The reason they're surprised is because they're not looking at this, what I've published. If you look at that and you can agree with it, it's been peer reviewed now, it's not a shock, it's not a surprise. This is it. So, you know, I managed to have a little bit of a conversation with him about, like, is that a termination shock? And he said, yes, it is, basically.
Should you just go over that science really briefly
Yeah.
for people that haven't seen those previous episodes where we talked about Earth's energy imbalance and the aerosols? The concept Claire's referring to about James Hansen's work is it's framed as Earth's energy imbalance, and it gives a much bigger, a more complete picture of the climate system than what we've been thinking, because we tend to think only about greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases stop the Earth radiating out the energy that we've absorbed from the sun. But that's only half the picture, because when we burn fossil fuels, we don't just give off greenhouse gases, we give off aerosols. And those aerosols, as Claire said, they serve to create clouds, and those clouds reflect back the solar energy before it even hits the surface of our planet. Aerosols themselves, even without creating clouds, they reflect back the heat. So when we think in terms of Earth's energy imbalance, we start thinking about that energy coming into the planet as well as the energy leaving. And what we're seeing at the moment, because we're still emitting greenhouse gases, but we're emitting less aerosols because we're cleaning up some of the fossil fuels we burn, is it means that not only is the greenhouse effect getting stronger and stronger, stopping our planet radiating out its energy, but we're also getting more energy in the first place because we've got less cloud and less aerosols in the atmosphere. So when we start thinking about it in this way, it makes us see that we have two problems, not just one, don't we? We have a decline in aerosols as well as the continued growth of greenhouse gases. And once you start seeing it in terms of those two different problems, then you have to, it makes you realize that maybe there's two areas of solutions we need. Even if we, you know, reach net zero or net negative very, very soon and stop strengthening the greenhouse effect, we still have the problem of this increased incoming solar radiation because the air's cleaner and there are fewer clouds. So what does Hansen say about how we can address this second problem?
Well, so that's the interesting thing, is that Jim has drawn the conclusion that we have to act very quickly to deal with the energy imbalance. And the most discussed kind of form of intervention in that way is a thing called SRM, which is solar radiation management. And the most commonly discussed version of solar radiation management, because there are a few different things like knocking around in that field of research, is a thing called SAI, which is stratospheric aerosol injection, which means that you would get planes that can go up to a very high level into the stratosphere, and they would put some kind of a particle matter, spray it into there, and then leave it to deflect light and help to form clouds. The problem with that, you know, it was really interesting for me to sit and to meet Jim and other people at the conference who basically saying, because it's so late and so bad and we're so incapable of even curbing the growth in emissions, we obviously have to do some other kind of intervention. And the most commonly discussed intervention is this, because it intervenes precisely on energy imbalance. And it does it on a planetary level, so it's an all-system kind of conversation.
So when those aerosols are released into the stratosphere, they would disperse evenly across the planet. You couldn't aim for regional effects or anything like that.
Well, I think that's what people don't know. Okay. So there are people who have been researching this for a long time, and there are some people who've been researching this for not a very long time. And whilst I was there was actually a news article that I got sent about an American firm, private company, that is being run by technicians who used to work for Israel, but they're working out of America now, and they've just raised 60 million in private capital to push forward their research. They're called Stardust, because they're researching a particle that they think is going to be inert, and that I think they will look to patent as a concept and then, you know, deploy at scale. And so in terms of where this conversation is at, you know, there's like there's a spectrum of people, I would say, ranging from no, don't do it, never do it, don't even research it, because by researching it you make it possible, right through to fuck you, we're going to do it anyway, and we've got $60 million and you won't be able to probably stop us, so this is going to happen. and in between on that spectrum are a whole load of different positions and people in the movement, experts, climate experts, technicians, blah, blah, blah. And, interestingly, Jim just said, looking at my analysis, I don't see that we've got any choice other than to do this. And he even went so far as to say, if you don't let young people do it, because you're going to wag the finger at them, old people, and he was getting at old people, and he was saying, if you tie an arm behind the backs of the young with a planetary scale level of intervention that might work, then you're tying the only arm that they've got left, because the other one has already been done by taking nuclear power off the table.
So he's talking to the people that want a moratorium and want to take this option off the table before it starts. He's saying that's unfair because people need all the cards that are available, all the tools available to them.
The team who invited me to their conference is a organisation called Operatio Arctis, and they are young people who were involved in Extinction Rebellion. They met through XR, and now they're trying to understand whether there are interventions that can be made in service to the Arctic as Arctic peoples, and that's why they're doing the work they're doing. So they're very keen, as far as I understand their position, they're very keen to know whether it's too dangerous to ever do, or whether we should do more research to find out in case there's a chance that there's an intervention to be made that gives you more time. And they're young people, and they're saying, let us have our cards on the table, stop taking them away, kind of thing. That doesn't mean that they're advocating to just do it and just get on with it, which there also were people who sounded like that, in and around that conference. And it's a highly contested space, because it's not just whether or not it's the right thing to do and whether or not we can ever understand what the impacts might be, because it seems to me it's extremely hard to understand whether this will ever be controllable. You just spray it up there and cross your fingers and hope for the best. It can have all kinds of unwanted side effects. And then there's this thing called determination shock that people worry about, which is basically if you did succeed in lowering the Earth's temperature in a whole system sense, which is a pretty extraordinary thing to think about doing. But if you did manage to do that and you had to sustain these aerosol injections, well, then whoever owns the means to do that, to keep the temperature down, has basically got the ultimate bargaining chip against the entire planet's inhabitants, which either could leave it wide open to all kinds of disruption on a personal level between nation states, who produces the aerosols, who does the technology, who pays for it, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's a world of hellish complexity, and there's a whole load of people I met there as well who are researching and working on how to do governance and trying to think about how do you do tipping points governance, how do you do governance of interventions, geoengineering, all of this stuff, because obviously when you look at that as a sort of possible thing that could happen and it's quite scary, then you think, well, who's gonna decide? How the fuck do you decide to do that? Yeah. And actually, there's definitely one part of this space where you think actually there's probably a bunch of people who just decide to unaccountably do it. And one of their panels included a guy just saying, to be honest, if it's really necessary and nation states won't cough up, someone rich could just do it. Elon Musk could just do it. Yeah,
they could. But even then, that still requires governance, because even if we did all the research, we had a very, very good idea of what the total amount needed, or the rate at which it had to be added to the atmosphere, or whatever. The actual implementation, not just in the long term, in the short term, it needs coordination. If you got 3 different billionaires in different parts of the world all doing it a bit, how do they arrive at the exact same amount? It really is a coordination problem, and it's not just the maintenance of it over the long term. It is immensely complex. The ultimate thing that you were getting at but didn't quite say is that once it starts, it has to go on forever, or until the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations are back down to where they were. This is what you're referring to as the risk of termination shock. If we start doing this, then without addressing the mitigation, then the planetary system will keep on getting warmer as greenhouse gases keep on accumulating, but that effect will be masked by the aerosols, so we won't feel it getting warmer, but it will be getting warmer underneath this mask, this umbrella. So yeah, the moment you stop, then you have this giant leap in temperature, which is terrifically scary. But as you say, we're going through a termination shock now. Of we have been inadvertently running an aerosols experiment over all these decades, and the unfortunate thing is that the cleaning of shipping fuels and cleaning of industry in China, whilst it has achieved lots and lots of brilliant things, and it's great for health and it's great for greenhouse gases, it has brought about this sort of termination shock that we're undergoing now. And that's why climate change is accelerating now, and accelerating. It's not just because of fossil fuels. It's not because of feedbacks in the planetary system that have been unleashed. It's because of the worsening Earth's energy imbalance. And this is something that's got to be dealt with anyway, because as we decarbonize the rest of society, fossil fuel emissions are still growing. What happens to aerosols once we're burning half the amount of fossil fuels, once we're burning a quarter of the amount of fossil fuels? Where are the aerosols coming to maintain the aerosol mask that we already have now? So yeah, we talk about the risk of termination shocks from geoengineering, but there is a termination shock that will happen from decarbonisation, and that still has to be dealt with.
Yeah, it's what James Hansen calls a Faustian bargain, which is we've made a deal, basically, that we can pollute more but feel the effect less because we've got this aerosol component to the pollution that we make. And, one of the other things that I mentioned in our conversation, but we didn't really expand upon, was, that his research on aerosols is quite old. It's not news. And actually, alongside suppressing the information about the warming effect that would come, the heating effect that would come from carbon emissions, the fossil fuel industry also knew about aerosols. And they also knew that if we polluted a lot, we would feel less than what we'd done because of the aerosol problem. Now, the other thing that's a problem with the aerosols that cause this masking effect or this lower temperature is that they have a really short life expectancy. And so comparatively, the carbon that we emit that heats the planet can continue to take effect for decades. And the aerosol masking is caused by a pollutant that disappears in days. And so that's another thing to think about, when people are proposing this intervention of radiation management, of putting these aerosols into the atmosphere, is not just that we're talking about combating pollution with pollution and that we're doing something that's a mad fucking experiment on the planet that we don't know how it will play out, we're also doing something which, as you say, needs to be permanently kept up. And something I'd never thought about until a few months ago when I was talking to somebody who was interested in this kind of intervention space and geoengineering research, is that it's often cited that the companies that would be able to deploy this kind of stuff would necessarily be aerospace, would necessarily be like tied therefore to arms and defence and all of that. But also that once you've got companies that want to deploy something like that, and they know they're in for a very long-term contract because you can't ever stop, you've also got then a whole load of people will want to build up the company interest and the business interest to do the monitoring, because you'll have to then keep an eye on it to know how it's going, which presumably means you're going to need more machinery, more technology, more planes, more data, more surveillance of it, blah, blah, blah. So it's complicated. And my sense is that with this whole discussion, first thing that feels clear to me is that there are other modes of intervention that different people are advocating for. And I think often people use the word geoengineering as a stand-in term for aerosol injection, which actually, if you look behind the word geoengineering, you'll find a lot of different stuff. The second thing is that I don't know how we can expect, you know, that old phrase, don't solve a problem by using the logic that caused it. Yeah. If you think that a capital obsessed kind of business model is going to somehow produce the technology and the system that will be your salvation from the thing that's been caused by, you know, extreme fossil capitalism, you may be on hiding to nothing, in my view. If you can't have these conversations in a way that radically tries to think about solutions that you could try that don't actually make anyone rich. Because I think they, you know, that seems like it's not, that conversation's not really in the room. And if you talk to somebody like Ye Tao, who says, you know, I want to create mirrors that deal with energy imbalance, but they do it in a sort of place-based way for like extreme heat relief. And, you know, it means that you can easily take it down and it can belong to the community.
On the ground.
Yeah, and it can belong to the community where it is, and you can test it and you can see if it helps you, and you can take it away again, and it's cheap, but it's also in the hands of people on the ground, and it's not been done by a for-profit company. It's not been done to them by a government or a military or anything like that. Then I think you're having a conversation about doing something on a systemic level that's different. What I then don't know is how you have a conversation about an intervention on an Earth system scale, which doesn't involve capital. Because obviously, if you come to the conclusion you have to make a response like that, you need loads of fucking money, because you've got to do it on a planetary level. And that's not going to be cheap, even if it's a cheap solution, which stratospheric aerosol injection, according to the experts that I've met, is fucking cheap. It's a cheap answer. And that's also scary, because it means that somebody could deploy it if they've just got tons of money and they decide that they know best. And there's not really very strong governance, and international law ain't looking that strong right now, frankly. But also, you know, because it's a cheap solution that keeps the fucking wheels on for longer. So if you patch things up to normalise how we are now, cool the planet a bit, carry on emitting, that's the other fear, is that it will just make people think, well, we've fixed it now because we took the temperature down, so just let's burn on.
That's
exactly
it. That's exactly it. And that's the big fear for me, is that we have an incredible range of climate solutions, high tech, low tech, you know, just every solution you can imagine. The solutions that are heavily promoted by media and powers that be are the solutions that allow us to carry on with the system as it is now. Like, you know, tree planting, carbon offsets. Sorry, not carbon offset, carbon capture and storage. It's all about solutions that you can do at the periphery that will allow, if they worked, will allow the planet-eating system to carry on unchecked. And this is so it can be used as an excuse for inactivity, and this I can really see being used as an excuse for inactivity. If the research shows it might work, if the pilots studies show it might work, whatever, then one interpretation of that is that, okay, now we have the technology to undo the bad effects of greenhouse gases. Therefore, why do we need to stop emitting greenhouse gases? We can mask them now. There's no reason for us to stop. And it will be used in that way. Of course it will be used that way, because there's so much interest in not stopping burning oil, in perpetuating the system as it is now. And so that's always the danger of any solution that isn't systemic in approach. Any solution that doesn't get to the heart of the problem, that get to the cause of the problem, will be favoured, because it doesn't get to the cause of the problem, and the cause of the problem is hugely profitable for those that own everything.
Yeah, and I think, that was one of the pieces of feedback that I gave to the organisers, was that if the conversation about interventions doesn't happen in the same room as the conversation about change on a systemic level to our human-made systems, to our economies, to our governance, people saying we need to talk about governance for geoengineering or governance for tipping points. But I'm like, we're already doing governance of tipping points. It's just we're doing them now without saying that that's what we're doing. We've been doing governance of geoengineering for the last few hundred years whilst we've been re-engineering the earth, not doing governance over it, just doing it and then doing governance of other systems. So we might be governing ourselves as an international community or the economy or international trade or whatever, but we're not then saying, see that those trade arrangements are the governance of our tipping points. So there's quite a lot of potential, I think, to pull the behaviours and the things that we're enacting right now, together with the conversation about, speculatively, what would you do if you had to govern the Earth system through tipping points? Well, let's pull that question into the present, away from it being a sort of thing about what should we be doing, and into okay, we're already doing it. So not only do we need to think about how to do a better job of it, or any job of it, but we also need to do that from a sort of position of recognising we're in course correction territory, which is what Laurie Laybourne's been saying, right? You're on a ship, you've gone into the storm, now you've got to navigate and be in the storm at the same time. Whereas before you were just headed towards it and trying to navigate. But once you're in it, then you have these other conditions to try and work within. I mean, honestly, I don't know what else to say apart from that I'm engaging with people who are having these conversations, partly because I notice that a lot of the movement is refusing to talk to them. And they're not just going to go away just because people decided to sit over here and say, well, we just think it's a really bad idea, so you're just going to make things worse. Because there's the whole load of research community and people fundraising capital, some of whom are doing very well, who look like, the horse has already left the stable, so to speak. So where do we then find ourselves? I'm not on a side on this, but I am not going to sit on one side or the other and say we shouldn't talk about it, because it's there. And I think, it is helpful to be sort of somewhat in the conversation and try to sort of be aware of how it's progressing and who's doing what, and finding out what the arguments for and against. I mean, on the way there to this conference, I was reading papers about the antinomies of geoengineering by Andreas Malm. I was reading all this stuff. I'm trying to like look at the critical views, but then I'm also going to go and, I don't know, talk to the researchers who, some of whom are saying it's a perfectly good idea. We should bloody do it. Look at the data. Look at where we are. Look at where we actually are. And that's Jim's position. You know, he just says we are where we are. It's probably not that big of a deal to test it a bit. Bloody get on with it. You know, so it's not great news because I wouldn't even be having this conversation with you if we weren't in the position that we're in, basically having like, I don't know, like no clue how to stop the fossil fuel industry still in 2025, apparently. Sort of things are vaguely moving in the right direction, but we're nowhere near getting the emissions to go down. So yeah, I don't know.
You say that, but that's the tricky thing about all this. Like, you know, the reason this becomes necessary is because we failed at the first thing, stopping fossil fuels, stopping emissions. But this isn't an alternative to that. Like, it can only work if we succeed in that. So we do now have to, you know, do a second thing, but that second thing is still contingent on the first thing, because we can't do that without rapidly reducing emissions. So that's just fucked, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty bad. And I don't think that most people in the space want to have the conversation about doing interventions like this without there also being a commitment to dealing with emissions and reducing them, mitigating them, and even drawing them down or working on those things. Because in and around this space, you'll also find yourself, you know, at an event talking to somebody who's got a business completely built around carbon drawdown, carbon removal stuff, right? So you also, I mean, that's a whole world of pain if you're in the climate campaigning space, and like mostly people will say you can't be serious about carbon removal technology and carbon capture, and it's all crap, it's all made up, it's all unicorn tech, it doesn't work, it's bullshit. But within all of this field of, you know, you do encounter like the full spectrum of all of these kind of things, and very few spaces that I've been in where there's the potential for the parallel conversation that has to be part of it, which is about system change. Yeah, it's completely mind-blowing, basically.
So just very briefly before we end, how are people looking forward to next steps in that conference? So we talked about the need for global governance. You know, people are starting to bring together actors to have these discussions formally. Are there any steps being taken to, you know, start formalizing governance of it? I mean, what's happening on a global scale? Anything?
I'm not sure how global attempts at governance are going, apart from some discussions that have happened at the COP level, at the IPCC kind of COP type level, where, you know, it feels like there's a massive push against to say, no, we shouldn't do any of this stuff. But there's also a more localized governance conversation about how you deal with people on the ground in the place where you're going to do deployment. That is also interesting, because somebody else who's on their board of Operatio Arctis is the head of the Sami Parliament. And some of the people who listen to this might remember that, like, back in, I don't know, 2019 or something, there was a proposed experiment basically over Sami land, which got canned because the researchers were American and they wanted to deploy in Finland. That was beaten down. The environmental movement who joined with the Sami people to push back and say, no, you can't run a big experiment over us. What are you doing? You know, that won on their favour. And one of the people who was involved in that from the American research side, David Keith, was also at this conference, and he was, they had quite an interesting exchange about why that didn't happen and how the governance could be done differently in a way which would include the people in the place where they're going to run the experiment to give their consent or not, or whatever, to involve them in decision making about whether or not these things take place. And I also know that in Townsville in Australia, there's been a marine cloud brightening project that was developed to put more cloud cover above the coral reef. And because they apparently did quite a good public engagement process with the people on the ground there, they found a lot of people in favour of that intervention in particular, because people have got an emotional attachment to the reef, and anything that you can do to stop it from getting bleached and overheating, people would say, well, if it helps to keep it and slow down its deterioration or slow down the heating of it, then yeah, on balance, like, make a few clouds, let's try that. So I'm aware of much more sort of process and approach that's been, you know, either successful or unsuccessful, but the lessons have been learned in terms of like doing governance on a more localised scale. There was also something planned to be done in Cornwall, wasn't there, recently, that got canned because the locals kicked off about it, and that was a different intervention. That was dumping some kind of chemical or mineral in the ocean. So that, you know, there's also lots of people in this space who they want to do ocean fertilization and various different like experiments like that. But I mean, all of it is like a bit of a sort of sci-fi nightmare, basically. But I do, you know, the local governance thing, I can see people working on how to do a decent job of that. But then how you do a good job of local governance, but a terrible job of international governance is, you know, with something that you don't really quite know where the effects are going to end up, because you're just spraying things into the atmosphere. You know, it feels like we're really just at the beginning of exploring this stuff. And if I'm honest, one of the things that worries me the most about it is not that it's a good idea or a bad idea, but that it's taking up a lot of people's headspace when there's an awful lot to do. And if it's a dead end because we look at it and go, oh my God, we didn't realise that means you definitely should never do it. Like, no one knows where the handbrake is and whether there is one inbuilt enough that would work if it was going to be monetarily beneficial to somebody to do, and that it's just taking up loads of bandwidth. So yeah, I mean, it's I'm being very honest in saying that I have no idea which way's the right way to lean on any of it, but I'm just trying to pay attention and hopefully help to bridge a bit between worlds, I guess.
Well, it's important that you are, and it's important that that's something we try to do on this show. I think you know, it's been years now since we first started talking about the aerosol problem and Earth energy imbalance, and still very few people are talking about this. You never hear about the aerosols problem. You never hear about this basic science of why the planet is accelerating. Yeah, we hear about solar radiation management, perhaps because it's, you know, there are business interests in it, but we don't hear about this issue more broadly. We don't talk about it broadly enough in the scientific community. We don't talk about it enough in the activism and change-making community either. I suspect if we keep our show going, we will be having these discussions more and more in the future.
Yeah. And also, you know, there's several people who I spoke to at the conference. Maybe we can revisit this with a lens on some of their work, you know, not least that people come up to me and go, oh, Claire, if you're interested in this, maybe you want to know about our ocean fertilization project because we're doing research on this other thing, or maybe you want to know about this sea ice thickening project and how that's going to go out, and we think we can run it out in Canada and it might be really interesting. And there's a world of stuff here which is like, you know, to the curious person is interesting, but it also does put in sharp relief that the situation is amazingly fucking bad if people are thinking about these kinds of responses, basically.
Yeah, incredible that we find ourselves here,
yeah,
isn't it?
Well, thanks for that, Charlie. I mean, it's yeah, difficult but important conversations, and next time we'll be here, we're going to have a chat about some more localized things, so from the sort of overwhelmingly planetary scale back down to a bit more back down to the ground, because we've got lots of movement happening on UK politics and local organising, and a whole load more reports as usual, following up on, you know, adaptation and flood risk and health and inequality and all of those good things that we always talk about. So yeah, see you next time.
Cheers.